Hi, my name is Benedict. This is a companion video for the one that I did a few days ago about making sure that your music has flow, and I sort of said, essentially the number one problem that I see with tracks coming off as not professional sounding is not to do with technicalities with mix and what have you, anywhere near so much as a lack of flow in how the material works. And it's possible to have quite technically imperfect work that flows wonderfully and therefore works really well. And it's also possible to have what people might call technically perfect work with poor flow. And it doesn't matter how shiny that thing is, it's still a steaming pile of whatever. And that our job when we're working as composers, if we've put ourselves in the producer chair, I do not see composer and producer as being the same thing. We tend to take the same roles, but you have to be able to separate that out. Often what happens is somebody works as a composer and goes, well, that's all of my vision, it's done, and send it off. And you end up with stuff that's kind of like this. Here's something I threw together very quickly, not about whether it's good or bad, not about whether you like it or not. I'm going to show you some of the problems that we have with this, which will not ever really go away. There are ways around them that an experienced mix engineer will use, but they're nowhere near as successful as if you did the work yourself in the first place. And just goes around like that. It's essentially a blob of sound. Yes, it works because our notes are all okay. They're all safe enough with regards to each other. We've actually got melodic movement and some kind of melody in the sense that we have our lead and our string and our bass and our piano, whatever, sitting there doing their thing. But it's very dense. We don't have any sense of movement. As I just wrote to somebody, and this is no way aimed at any particular person at all. If you take it that way, then you're adding something that's not there. My job is to help people tell their stories, and this is all about helping you tell your story with better flow, which means it's more efficient, more effective. People are more likely to get the subtlety, the nuance of feel. As I said to them, music is about defining silence. And I know that might seem funny because you're like, music's about getting rid of silence, music's about covering up silence, but no. There is a relationship between sound and not sound. If there is no sound, there's silence. If there is no silence, there might as well be no sound. It's like there can't be happy without unhappy, there can't be up without down. And it's very, very common, especially in the modern approach to things, where we go, but none of that's the case. Okay, your business. But the problem is that it doesn't change the fundamental reality of things. We have night and we have day. And day is bright because we have night, which is dark because we have day, which is bright. We need that balance. As a musician, as a mix engineer, if you're putting yourself into the role of record producer, then you have to understand how to balance that sound versus silence, how to use sound to frame silence, how to use silence to frame sound. Now that's putting in a very black and white way, sort of saying we had silence until we turned on Metallica's One at 20,000 watts of power, and we had no silence, and then we turned it off and had silence. But if you listen to One by Metallica, then there's a lot of interplay with subtleties of elements of silence versus not silence. The whole big bit where they go head shaking in the middle of the video, that's all interplay between silence and not silence. It's not like the Ramones, it's whatever the rhythm is. You get my point. That the fact that those rhythms are the way they are means that they're playing with silence and not silence. But we need to do it subtly as well. The problem that we've got with this is that every sound is trying to fill every part of the mix all the time. None of them seem to want to let go. And it's not helping. While we can say, oh yeah, it's great, because if we focus on the musical idea, yeah, it's working, that's great, cool. But we've only done half our job. As a mix engineer, I can come along and finesse it a bit, but I can't deliver the same results as if you had done it from the beginning. So let's actually just mute them all for the moment and work our way through. This is not the way that I would work, but I work this way because I know a lot of you do. We start with drums, and often what people do is they get their kick drum and they make it big and huge because there's no other thing happening. On its own you can go, yeah, that's good, man. It's got like lots of... But in the mix it becomes really problematic. If we don't have much going on, if it's this and Eminem talking about how he snapped his thongs, yeah, okay, fine, because there's just the kick drum and Eminem whining about how his flip-flop snapped on Miami Beach. Great. Nothing against Eminem, I'm just picking something. But as soon as we try to do more, we end up with some serious issues. If we add in our bass, again, it's easy to think, well, it's sort of great because it's full, but notice how we really lost all the punch of those drums. Those drums don't really do their job. And if we look at the bass alone, we might go, oh yeah, that's kind of cool, but together, they're just this glob, a rumbling, rolling glob. And making music, as I said, is about using sound to frame silence, using silence to frame sound. So let's look at what we should do. And I won't labour the drum thing too much because I'm not massive on drums, but just understand that I'm also saying exactly what Mr. Deadmau5 recently said. And I know that people didn't want to agree with him, and that's their business, but one of us in this equation has had, well, there's a known name, shall we say. Let's look at just our drums. So if we take our kick, it's huge and full and what have you, but what if we tighten it up? Oh, that's actually my snare, sorry. We've already got a clearer rhythm straight away. We've still got a lot of whoop coming off, but now that means we can actually turn that drum up a little bit. Let's look at our snare. We've got quite a bit of reverb. It's a nice, rough, coarse, Benedict-style reverb. But we're not here to judge the reverb, because the reverb deliberately is going to make things worse. It's going to make it more kludgy. And on that point, I have listened to several mixes recently where it's almost like they're running two mixes at once. They've got some reverby sounds and some non-reverby sounds, but rather than sharing the same bus, there just seem to be two completely separate mixes coming at me at once. I'm just like, oh. Unless there's a real reason to do that, your mix is actually broken. And the idea is it's one mix. If you watch the Dan Worrell video where he plays us a little mix and asks us to explain what we hear, he goes off and says, well, you heard drums and bass and what have you, but in reality there's one sound. Same thing, one sound. So we've tightened all of this up, and with nothing but a little bit of tightening up, if we pop this back into our mix, actually it probably should be. Hear how that's a little clearer already. If we were to take just our drums, I'm just going to do the solos over here easier. Hear how that's got better definition already. I can't really A-B because I'm not going to go backwards and forwards like this, but get the point that by tightening those sounds, by not feeling that they have to fill the whole world, we get exactly what we need. If we wanted that snare to be longer, We can. And there's now more space for it to happen. Whilst we have that super long kick drum, hear how there isn't a contrast, so the snare ends up sounding small. If we super need the super long kick drum, and we don't have a super busy mix, we create the contrast by pulling that snare right back. But super long kick drums rarely serve anybody. Okay, improved. Now let's look at this bass sound. It's low and it's just flubbing and rumbling. There's no EQ on anything in here. This is not about an EQ. And EQ is not really going to solve this problem. We can solve some problems in this mix with EQ, but this is not the point. It's all about time. Just flub and rumble. When your drum and bass combination is called the rhythm section for a reason. It's supposed to give us the rhythm. We've now got clarity. Let's pop that back with the drums. Much better. Blob. If I were mixing it, I'd be compressing the pair together to make them groove together. I didn't even look at how much these things do groove together, but that's better. The whole idea being, let's look at this relationship of envelope to clear the sounds out of the way. See here, even raising that filter attack just a tiny bit gives a little bit more definition on the front of that bass sound as we get a little bit of movement there. We could even try using pitch here. It does help. I'm just going to pull back that reverb a little bit. It is excessive there. I'd forgotten that I hadn't pulled it back because normally I do the reverb on the rhythm bus. That's better. Okay, now we can clearly hear that we've got this rhythm. Dum 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 dum. That's really clear. Whereas here it's sort of like ooh, becomes the dominant thing. Nobody goes to turn on the radio to hear ooh, unless they're into drone music. But if that's the case, it's a whole different ball of wax. Assuming you want people to go to the radio to feel, then we've got to do this. So now that is mixable. That's going to work out. What do we got next? We've got this piano, guitar-y synth line. Not about judging the sound, remember? But again, it just totally fills the world. It's tried to take over. There is no space in there, which means that we really can't feel its rhythmic stuff because it just essentially becomes blah. It's not the point. The whole idea is that this has got a blah, 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 blah. So let's pull that back out. Let's get rid of that sustain. I'm not going to raise the filter envelope here because that's suddenly going to turn into a brass sound. which A, will offend most of you because you seem to hate synth brass, poor sad individuals, and because it's been presented as being a piano guitar-y type sound. So let's honour that. Now, I talked about using sustain last time, but you see me cut some of the release here because it does have a rhythmic element to it. It's like the piano lines in a classic rock song or whatever. It's bringing the rhythm forward in a melodic fashion. Hopefully, if sending this off the stems, whoever would have actually muted these effects, because you see they tend to just fill up space as well, and the question is, are they really suited to the mix? They're suited to the sound on its own, but are they suited to the mix? So a lot more clarity now than we had. If we go back to our original, half improved, big noticeable difference. So the original is just a heavy blob of sound with very little rhythmic movement. There's none of that light and play that we need. And now we've got a clear sense of what the composer is doing. In no way am I saying that this is a good mix. It's unbalanced, and I'm not going to balance it deliberately to show you how, without even doing anything on the volume sliders, we can clarify the intent of the composer big time. Let's look at this lead. This lead is what I refer to as a lemon juice sound. It's one of those sounds that when you hear them, you can't help but get a fruit juice face. It's like, ooh, I just swallowed lemon juice. I know they have been super fashionable, so some people won't like me daring to suggest that they are problematic. They are problematic because they kind of take up a whole lot of space in your mix. This sound is so heavy use of resonance can be very problematic, but it also just hangs. This should not be allowed in a sound unless there's a particular purpose for it. If you need it to hang so you can do soloing in a monophonic mode, which this is not set to, but could easily be, but you note several things there. There's constant movement, and I let go. I changed my name to Winter. That was awful, because there was no sense of spacing. So it doesn't mean that you can't have your sustain up, but in a situation where the sound's just going to get in the mix and hold and hang there, becomes like somewhere between a dead dog and chalk. And this is not good. So let's look at how we can frame that for the performance. Not for, I liked the sound like that. How does it sit with the performance? Notice how straight away, the moment I drop that sustain, so that we've got the standard 5-second release here, or decay here, immediately that starts to move better. It doesn't fully go away. It's not like we end up with a... because that's a different line altogether. Maybe it's cool, but it probably isn't what we were looking for. But nonetheless, even just with this little bit of taper, It helps the next note come in because it's starting to move away. The next note comes in, it's like, oh, so we're still using a balance of full noise to no noise, silence to sound. We're playing with a balance there. So we could try this. That's helped with our phrasing tremendously. Not great phrasing, but it has helped with our phrasing tremendously. We can look at our envelope here, but it's probably not as important now. No, I'm happy with where it was. We can look at its release. Again, no, I'm happy enough with that because we have that moving, we have the level moving, so overall this sound is constantly moving the whole time it's in play. And that's important. If you paid $1 million for David Beckham to come over and play on your soccer team, he walked into the middle of the field and stood there, how impressed would you be? He'd be flying back to Victoria pretty darn fast. You wouldn't be like, I paid you so many millions of dollars to stand there like a dill. And if he turns around and goes, oh, but I'm so famous, you know, the audience applauded when I came on and I wanted them to be able to see me. Nah, the audience applauded the fact that you'd shown up to play. So, movement here. And it didn't take much. You see, we've now got a lot of movement. Pop this back in our mix. Fully up, owning the mix in a bad way. So there's big clarity. Notice there's a massive difference in the clarity of everything that's there. We can hear what's going on. We've got one more instrument to look at, and that's our string line. This has almost managed to become a lead in this situation. Now, we shouldn't compose in the way that I've done of just piling every possible thing that we might want in our song into 4 bars. That's just really an unwise way of doing things. So by rights, we shouldn't really have that lead and this hammering away at the same time, at least not until later in the song. But the strings are too aggressive. Look at them, they just beep, beep, beep. They just switch on and off. Yes, they've got a slight Newmanism to them. Anything well when you're working on a fourth, or maybe it's a fifth, fourths, fifths, whatever. So the sound itself is okay, but the problem is that within the context of the mix, it has no elegance. It doesn't move. So let's look at just doing the same thing with the... And that's good, that works, but if we wanted a string like a sustained, keep going guys, keep going, then that's not the solution. We can lengthen this. You can hear it fading over time, so it allows other things to come through. It's achieved its point, but it's still staying there. Taking it out means that it's got a different point. But we still feel that it's there. We're still aware of it tracking through, but it's making space to allow for other things, like that lead to continue to play its role without being swamped by the supporting part. Let's also look at attack. Great, but we have some issues there that it just doesn't speak quite right. So let's raise the release. That sounds nice. Now I've put in no extra performance stuff like I talked about last time. Deliberately didn't want to. I wanted to work on one axis. So yes, it should have velocity and what have you, but I wanted to show you how much we can achieve with one axis. So if you can achieve as much as I'm achieving here just with this, then imagine if you put together the velocity, the phrasing, and the enveloping, the tone and level over time. So that's working nicely there. There are situations where this starts to slow that line down, so it feels like it's behind where you want it to be. You've got a couple of options. One is you can go into your MIDI, grab all your instruments, and shunt them back that way, as in just move their starts back. That's one way of doing it. The other way, which is probably more elegant, but it depends on the situation that you have at hand, is most DAWs have some sort of groovination system, in which case you can grab something, and if it has a slide, as in you can move the timing of this track. Sometimes that's even done with a VST, like a VST that will use plug-in delay compensation to shift this whole track backwards and forwards. Find out what your DAW does. That's not really for me to support. But we can take our whole track, we need to assign it to, in this case, A1, and we're going to slide it back in time, or forward, back in time, I guess. Now those notes are actually playing 25 ticks before where they're supposed to play. But because they play slowly, as happens with strings and guitars, strummed guitars, they will actually play ahead of the beat, because this is what string players do. This is what guitarists know to do. Strumming guitarists actually play before the beat so that their whole chord appears to be on the beat. Freaky. They just do it because they just know that to feel in time, they're going to be early. It's not a thing they should even need to be taught. If they've got good feel, they will just naturally move. Just as when we've transitioned from driving a cable car, as in everything in that car, the accelerator and everything, was literally a piece of string, hello, thank you, a piece of string between the accelerator pedal and the go faster knob on the front of the engine. They became what's called drive-by-wire, so there's an electronic sensor here and an electronic sensor in a brain which sends messages to the go faster knob on the front of the engine. And when they first came in, there was what was called latency, and it was quite noticeable. People bitched about it, but the thing was, after you'd driven them for a few minutes even, if you were remotely open-minded, you actually found that you adjusted. In other words, you started to hit the accelerator pedal so many milliseconds early because your body knew that that was what was required to make the engine knob go at that time. So we just find the shape that makes our line flow nicely, and then we flow it back into timing this way. Yes, we do have a difference in our levels with drum and bass because they were very long, so they took up a lot of time. They got to fill up everything. And that's changeable. But if we just listen to the clarity of the composition, massive and kludgy. Easy, as you're doing it, to think, yeah, that's huge. But it's just kind of like taking something, turning the volume up to 13 so that you've got this completely crushed waveform and going, yeah. It's loud. It's not good, it's loud. So when you put that crushed overloud thing on the radio up against Madonna or anybody, then you find that you kind of lose. Yours sounds small and gluggy, and it's like, how do I overcome being non-pro? It's like just put in the time and energy to put in envelopes, time, handle the time. As I said in the last one, your responsibility is to handle every single individual sound from at least the moment it comes into the mix, if not before, because remember, silence is part of this sound, through its whole transition, not just going, oh yeah, I pressed it, now I've let go of it, now I can, that's all my job is. No, it's to understand how to make that flow, even with a bum note. And enveloping, and then sometimes shifting a track, is part of that job to make it flow so much nicer. Because believe me, the difference between me trying to do a good mix on the original blob and this is going to be chalk and cheese. Yes, our drum and bass probably want to come back up to achieve some of the same presence, but that's going to be handled far more easily and punched through the mix far more easily because the mix now has space. If we wanted that kick drum to seem more dominant, then we could pull back our snare. See how that's made a big difference already? Let's have a look at our kick. I'm not a big fan of this particular device. Not because it's wrong, I just kind of find like it doesn't work the way I want it to. Okay, might be a little too bright, but... No, not filter. EQ. I mean, this is stuff I said I wasn't going to do, but I appreciate people are going to be like, but. So let's find... That's doing its job. We've now got our rhythm working together, not as well as if I would have put them in a bus together and what have you, but it's all about understanding how to tailor time around our elements. So again, we had this. Which was a total blob. And we transition to this. Which flows so much nicer. Looking at overall levels. See how this part of the metering, the RMS, has actually dropped. Guess what? That means that it's actually possible for us to push this harder. Let's give it 3 dB, see what happens. So not only have we given ourselves the ability to push 3 more dB, but it's starting to be the same level, if not louder, because it's dynamic than this, which is a blob. It has more punch. There's probably more we could push in here as well if we really wanted to. So, by giving ourselves space, by handling our enveloping early, before it gets to the mix engineer, or before we turn around to mix it ourselves, so that we've got this beautiful flow, then we've actually given ourselves a far bigger palette in which to mix, because we've got more dynamic range. We've reduced the total RMS, that's the average level, we might seem to have the same difference between peak and RMS. We might have the same peak, but because the difference has expanded, as in if we had this much with our blob between our peak and our RMS, and now we've got this much between our peak and our RMS, we can do this. Yes, okay, this is going to be chopped, but this probably isn't serving as much purpose as you think it is. Therefore, you can make a louder mix or go between and have a more dynamic and louder mix at the same time. So no matter which way you're trying to squash your mango, you still get a better result if you take the time to watch how you envelope, how you handle your sounds through time. If you let them get into the mix and then hang like a dead dog or like chalkboards or nails on chalkboard, then you've got nowhere to go and it's just going to unpro what you've done. And your notes may be good, your notes may be lovely, but if they can't speak nicely, then all you've ended up with is a blob. So, companion, look at your phrasing and articulation through velocity, and of course spacing and what have you, as in the first video, but also very much, and I learned this stuff first because I didn't use velocity. My first synths didn't have velocity, so it just wasn't a thing that I could even do, even if I wanted to. I had to work out how to do everything just through time, which was envelopes. And having grown up with playing a harpsichord, you want something to be louder, you hold it longer. You want something to be more transient, you play it shorter. That's it. Yeah, that's your control over perceived level. You can't change the level of a harpsichord at all. If you hit it harder, you simply break it, and you start adding banging noises, which do not improve the performance in any way, shape, or form. It's not like playing a B3 or something where you hammer it and you might get oh, that's interesting. With a harpsichord, all you get is like, this guy's an idiot. It doesn't work. So you got short note, long note. That's your variation. So with synths, it kind of made sense. Okay, I've got to handle how this flows over time. So I learned the enveloping thing first, and then the velocity thing second. So I'm probably better at the enveloping thing than the velocity thing. If you have questions, ask them on down below. If it's about a particular piece, either hire me to mix it, or at least make sure I can hear it. I can't answer questions when I can't see and hear what's going on properly. You have a great day now.